20 minutes. John Phillips gave every artist 20 minutes. Janis Joplin got 20 minutes. The Who got 20 minutes. The Mamas and the Papas got 20 minutes. And some kid from Seattle who'd been playing in London got 20 minutes. But nobody at Monterey County Fairgrounds knew who Jimi Hendrix was. June 18, 1967. Monterey, California. The first major rock festival in American history was about to begin. 55,000 people gathered on the fairgrounds under the blazing California sun, spreading blankets on the grass, setting up cameras, preparing for something unprecedented. The lineup read like a who's who of American rock and British invasion royalty. The anticipation was electric. This wasn't just another concert, it was a cultural statement, a gathering that would define a generation. And buried somewhere in the middle of the schedule was a name that meant nothing to anyone there. Jimi Hendrix. Backstage, the hierarchy was clear and unforgiving. The established acts commanded respect, space, and attention. Janis Joplin held court with her powerful voice and magnetic presence. The Who prepared their explosive show with professional confidence. Pete Townshend discussing their plan to destroy their instruments. The Mamas and the Papas, the festival's organizers, moved through the area like gracious hosts. Brian Jones wandered through, greeting friends. Jerry Garcia sat cross-legged, tuning his guitar with zen-like focus. And in a corner, sitting quietly with a white Stratocaster across his lap, was a young black man with an afro that seemed to defy gravity. His clothes were unlike anything the American rock scene had seen, colorful, flowing, almost feminine by the standards of the time. He looked, to many observers, like he'd stepped out of a different world entirely. The contrast was stark. While established artists were surrounded by entourages, Jimi sat alone with Noel Redding and Mitch Mitchell, equally unknown to the American music scene, which in a way he had. The other musicians barely glanced at him. A few asked their managers who he was. The answers were vague and unimpressive. Some guitar player from Seattle, been living in London, never heard of him before this week. A journalist wandered by, notebook in hand, scanning for stories. He paused at Jimi's corner, considered approaching, then moved on toward the bigger names. The hierarchy was that clear, that established. Unknown meant unworthy of attention. One stagehand, loading equipment, paused near Jimi's corner. "You nervous, kid?" Jimi looked up with dark, calm eyes. "Not nervous, just waiting." The stagehand nodded and moved on. Nothing about the exchange seemed significant. Nothing suggested that history was about to be made. But in those quiet moments, Jimi was doing something the other artists weren't. He was listening, hearing each act through the backstage monitors, understanding the energy of the crowd, learning what worked and what didn't. Every performance was a lesson, every audience reaction a piece of information he filed away for later use. John Phillips, the festival's main organizer, had included Jimi almost as an afterthought. Paul McCartney had cornered him at a party in Los Angeles just 3 weeks earlier. "There's this American guitarist in London," McCartney had said, his voice carrying unusual enthusiasm. "Really something special. You should give him a shot." Phillips trusted McCartney's judgment. The Beatle had never steered him wrong before. But scheduling Jimi hadn't been a priority. He was slotted for Sunday evening, when the sun would be setting and some of the crowd would be leaving early to beat the traffic back to San Francisco. A throwaway slot for a throwaway act. Phillips had second-guessed the decision multiple times. With limited slots and massive demand from established acts, every spot was precious. Giving 20 minutes to an unknown felt like a gamble he couldn't afford. But McCartney's recommendation carried weight, and sometimes you had to trust instinct over logic. The irony was thick. This was Jimi's homecoming. He'd been born in Seattle, raised in America, learned guitar listening to American blues records. But America hadn't wanted him. He'd struggled for years in small clubs, backing singers who barely acknowledged his talent. It was only when he went to London that someone finally heard what he could do. Now he was back, carrying a British passport to credibility, but still unknown in his own country. Pete Townshend of The Who noticed him first, not because of his playing, Jimi hadn't touched his guitar yet, but because of his stillness. While every other artist was moving around, socializing, preparing, Jimi just sat, watching, learning the room. "Who's the quiet one?" Townshend asked a roadie. "Hendrix, American kid. Plays guitar, apparently." Townshend nodded absently. He had his own performance to worry about. The Who were planning to destroy their instruments at the end of their set, a trick that always drove crowds wild. It would be hard for any act to follow their explosive finale. As the afternoon progressed and acts took the stage one after another, the energy built steadily. Each performer added their piece to the growing legend of Monterey. But backstage, Jimi remained in his corner, occasionally tuning his guitar, but otherwise motionless. The sun began its descent toward the Pacific horizon. Golden light filtered through the backstage area, creating long shadows. Festival workers moved with increasing urgency as the schedule tightened. Everyone was feeling the pressure to keep things moving. "Hendrix, you're on in 10 minutes, a stage manager called out. Jimi stood slowly like someone emerging from a deep meditation. He slung his Stratocaster across his shoulder and walked toward the stage entrance. A few heads turned to watch him go. His walk was unhurried, almost casual. Nothing suggested he was about to change everything. The crowd was tired but satisfied. They'd seen good music all weekend. Some were heading home to beat traffic. Others were settling in for the final acts of the evening. The energy was pleasant, but not electric. It was the energy of people who'd gotten what they'd come for and were now ready for whatever else might happen. The announcement came over the PA system. "Ladies and gentlemen, from London, England by way of America, the Jimi Hendrix Experience." Polite applause, curious murmurs. Most people in the audience had never heard the name. Jimi walked onto the stage carrying his white Stratocaster. Behind him, Noel Redding on bass and Mitch Mitchell on drums took their positions. The trio looked small on the festival stage, almost insignificant after the larger productions that had come before. Jimi approached the microphone. The crowd quieted, waiting to see what this unknown act would offer. "I'd like to play a song for you," Jimi said quietly. His voice was soft, almost shy. "It's called Wild Thing." A few people recognized the title. The Troggs had made it a hit the previous year, a simple, catchy pop song, not the kind of material that usually defined careers or created legends. Jimi started playing. The first notes that came from his guitar were unlike anything the Monterey audience had ever heard. The sound was huge, distorted, controlled chaos that somehow maintained perfect musicality. His fingers moved across the fretboard with impossible speed and precision. But it wasn't just the sound. It was the way he moved, the way he held the guitar, the way he seemed to be having a conversation with the instrument. In the front rows, young women began screaming. Not polite appreciation, but something primal, uncontrolled. Men stared with their mouths open, trying to process what they were seeing. The crowd stirred. This wasn't what they'd expected. Behind him, Mitch Mitchell's drumming was thunderous but precise. Noel Redding's bass provided a foundation that allowed Jimi's guitar to soar. Backstage, conversation stopped. Other musicians turned toward the sound coming from the stage monitors. Pete Townshend, who'd been preparing for the Who's set, stood frozen. "What is that?" someone whispered. Brian Jones pushed closer to the monitors. "That's not possible," he muttered. Jimi played the opening riff of Wild Thing, but he played it with such passion, such raw sexuality, that it became a different song entirely. The simple pop tune transformed into something darker, more complex, more urgent. His face showed an almost religious ecstasy as his fingers found combinations of notes that shouldn't have worked together, but created harmonies that made the audience's skin tingle. Then he did something that made the crowd gasp. He played a passage behind his back, his fingers finding the frets by feel alone, never missing a note. It wasn't a gimmick. It was musical expression through physical impossibility. The audience was no longer tired. They were electrified. He played with his teeth, the Stratocaster's strings ringing clearly as his incisors found the precise spots needed to create melody. Again, it wasn't showmanship for its own sake. It was music emerging from places music had never come from before. Backstage, Janis Joplin stopped talking mid-sentence. "Who is this guy?" The song built toward its climax. Jimi's guitar wailed and screamed, but every sound served the music. Nothing was random. Nothing was accidental. This was complete artistic control masquerading as wild abandon. And then, at the peak of the musical intensity, Jimmy did something no one saw coming. He knelt down beside his amplifier. The crowd watched, confused, as he pulled something from his pocket, a small container of lighter fluid. Time seemed to slow as the audience realized what was about to happen before their minds could fully process it. This wasn't planned. This wasn't in any set list. This was pure artistic instinct taking over. Jimmy doused his guitar with the fluid. The Stratocaster that had just produced impossible sounds was about to be sacrificed. Some people in the crowd shouted, "No!" as if witnessing a murder. He struck a match. The flames erupted instantly, consuming the guitar that had just redefined what music could be. But Jimmy didn't step back. He played the burning instrument, coaxing final notes from strings that were beginning to melt, creating sounds that no one had ever heard before and would never hear again. The crowd went insane. 55,000 people exploded into chaos, screaming, cheering, weeping. Some stood on chairs, others fell to their knees. They had just witnessed something that would live in their memories forever. This wasn't just a performance. It was a religious experience, a moment when the impossible became reality. Backstage, the silence was deafening. Pete Townshend stood with his mouth open, his usual confidence completely shattered. The Who had been planning to smash their instruments. Now that seemed quaint, almost childish. How do you follow someone who just burned his guitar while playing it? "We can't go on after that," Townshend said quietly. "We can't follow that." Roger Daltrey nodded grimly. "Did you see the crowd? I've never seen anything like that reaction." John Phillips, the festival organizer who had given Jimmy a throwaway slot, stared at the stage monitors in disbelief. "Who did we just unleash?" Janis Joplin walked over with a look of stunned recognition. "That boy just showed us what we're all trying to do. Pure, unfiltered soul coming through an instrument." Brian Jones shook his head slowly. "The Stones have been pushing boundaries, but this is beyond pushing boundaries. This is creating new ones entirely." Other musicians who had barely noticed Jimmy an hour earlier now surrounded the monitors, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. This wasn't just good music. This was the sound of the future announcing itself. The crowd's ovation continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. They wouldn't let Jimmy leave. They needed more. They needed to confirm that what they'd just seen was real. But Jimmy had said everything he needed to say in 20 minutes. He walked off stage carrying the neck of his burned Stratocaster, leaving the crowd in the backstage area in the stunned silence. The ripple effects were immediate. Record executives who had ignored Jimi Hendrix began making frantic phone calls. Warner Brothers representatives immediately began negotiations to sign him. Radio programmers started asking about this unknown American who just set his guitar on fire. Music journalists scrambled to find anyone who knew anything about him. But the real impact wasn't in the business dealings. It was in the minds of every musician who had witnessed something that would change how they thought about their own art. Young guitarists went home and practiced differently that night. Established artists reconsidered their approaches to performance. Within days, Jimi Hendrix would be on magazine covers. Within weeks, his debut album would be climbing the charts. But all of that was still to come. Within hours, Jimi Hendrix was no longer unknown. The boy from Seattle who couldn't get recognition in his own country had just forced America to pay attention. The quiet kid who'd been sitting in a backstage corner had just announced the arrival of a new era in rock music. 20 minutes. That's all it took. 20 minutes to transform confusion into awe. 20 minutes to prove that talent will always find a way to announce itself. 20 minutes to remind everyone watching that art has no limits when it's in the hands of someone who truly understands its power. Pete Townshend would later say that Monterey was the moment rock music changed forever. Not because of the Who's performance, but because of what they witnessed from the side of the stage. "We came to Monterey thinking we were pretty good," Townshend reflected years later. "Then this kid from Seattle played for 20 minutes and showed us we'd been thinking too small." The festival continued after Jimmy's set, but nothing that followed could match what had just happened. Everyone knew they had just witnessed something historic. The unknown American who'd been living in London had come home and reminded his own country what it had lost and what it had just found again.